Welcome once again to In Isolation. I'm James Kerwin, webcasting from Los Angeles, California. And with me, as always, all the way from the other side of the world, from Surrey Hills, England, is my lovely co-host, Nicola Bryant. Hello, Nicola.
Hello. Hi, how are you doing?
That's an interesting question because as you know, I recently kind of cheated and broke quarantine. And just to be on the safe side, I went and got a coronavirus test the other day. So fortunately, I am negative. I assumed I probably would be, but just to be on the safe side. It's an interesting process. Very, very painless, easy. Mouth swab, not the nose one, not the crazy nose one.
And I understand you guys are going back into lockdown, which is probably what will happen to us again soon, because we're just coming out.
Yeah, things just opened prematurely. And I understand why a lot of people felt things needed to reopen. The economy is, it's taken a big hit because of this. But man, yeah, things were opening just too prematurely. So they're starting to shut down again in a lot of places over here.
Yeah.
But speaking of COVID-19, we have with us today somebody who actually had it.
Shall we bring on our fabulous guest star?
Yes. With us this week is Robert Shearman. He is an acclaimed playwright, short story writer, television writer, audio drama writer, and we're going to talk with him about these different facets of his career and how he transitioned from one to the next. I'm really looking forward to this.
Brilliant. So, hello, Rob.
Yes, hello. It's very, very good to see you.
We were just talking about COVID and coronavirus, having coronavirus, and I am told that you actually had COVID-19. Is that true?
It is true, yes. It's one of those rare things about celebrity that you don't really want to admit. It's odd, though, because I've got so many friends, particularly in the early days when I told them I've had COVID-19, they would treat me as if I'd been to the Groucho Club and met a famous actor. COVID-19 has sort of become the sort of, the most important superstar in the world. Yeah, I have had it. So has my wife. We've both survived it, which is not actually that hard because most people do. I feel a bit embarrassed about it, actually. I did a podcast some weeks ago and they billed me as COVID survivor. And I felt that was a little bit extreme because it wasn't that bad for us, really. It's not pleasant. We've both got sort of after effects which aren't especially nice. But in most instances for us, it was just simply a matter of sort of riding it out and trying not to feel too embarrassed about it, because it's that sort of, it was the early days. When you told people that you had it, it just made you feel like you were the stupidest people that they'd ever met. Because you'd been going out and this was the days before we had lockdown here in Britain, so it was very early on. But it just proved to me that I'd been careless. And then I just felt hugely ashamed, and I felt terribly guilty that by being careless, I must have infected other people. And I think months on, we have so much a far better idea about social distancing and about ways in which we can take care of other people. But back in early March, I was an idiot, and that's pretty much why I got it. I mean, a few days before I was riding the London Underground. So who knows? I found it very interesting that some of the first questions I got asked, particularly by my friends in the States, were, "Do you know who gave it to you?" And it could have been anybody. I mean, London has not been very good at dealing with the pandemic. I think that we are a world number one at times in just how badly we are dealing with it, and it's like a sort of shared responsibility of incompetence here at the moment, I think.
Look, I'm glad you got over it. I'm glad you're okay, all in all. So that's a blessing right there, But how interesting. It's really interesting. And, don't blame, in early March, a lot of people didn't know. A lot of people didn't know to socially distance. A lot of people weren't taking it seriously, Well,
that's what I mean. I was trying to. I just didn't realize how much I obviously wasn't. I wasn't hugging people. I was trying to keep my distance from them. But I was also, I think, hanging on to the idea that my ordinary life could still be preserved. I was aware, for example, that my new book was due out in April, and I still believed I'd be doing the book launch for it. I was reluctant to let go of the idea that anything was really going to change. I mean, I knew that something bad was coming, but like most things in life, I just thought, well, if so long as I sort of pay lip service to what I think would be a good idea, it's not going to happen really, because that's mostly sort of how I think in my lifetime, in my generation, things were. You know, we are part of a generation which didn't have to deal with a huge war, and if you're, as I am, middle class, white, privileged man, nothing really affects you that much. So you just sort of think, well, I'll just ride through it. And I tried riding through it, and it didn't really work. I think that's the hardest thing about it, is I just see friends and people online, and everyone seems angry with each other because no one can be quite sure what the right level of paranoia is. So, for example, I mean, I'm now, because I've recovered, I will go for several mile walks, socially distancing, and being very, very careful. And yet I have friends who are appalled that I'm doing that. And yet when I'm out, I'll see people who I think aren't taking it seriously enough and in the way I do. So I'm appalled at them. Then I've got friends who, I saw a friend recently who went out for the first time in 3 months and met a friend, socially distanced, and then felt so guilty about it on the way home, they put themselves in 7 days quarantine. And I feel a bit angry with them, because I just think, well, that's an overreaction. And the only reaction which is correct is my reaction. So that's fine. I've got the right level of paranoia. If they have too much, I'm annoyed with them. If they have too little, I'm annoyed with them. And I think that that's a general problem, is that none of us are quite sure how we can deal with the impact on this. We're all kind of pushing in the same direction, but because we can't do it to the same degree, we're all quite irritable with each other.
It is a cycle of people being annoyed with each other for varying degrees of...
Right.
I've had friends who have lost relatives during this, and they would have lost them naturally. It isn't COVID related, but suddenly being put in the position where they're having to ask themselves questions about whether they can spend their last days with them, and they're crying out to do so, and they think that either answer is the wrong answer, and either way they'll be judged. So if they go and see a friend had a dying partner but didn't go and see him, and felt obviously people were appalled at that, and yet she knew also people would be appalled if she had. So either way, you're just carrying this tremendous guilt, and you're staying indoors, and all you can see every day is that suddenly life has changed completely, and there's no guarantee you'll ever get it back. And I think everybody is very frightened, and therefore everybody is also quite angry, and often for very good reasons, and they will find outlets for their anger which are urgent and real, but at the same time also become huge things which people who are maybe in the government, in both of our governments, don't understand just the level of anger that there is now, which has been exacerbated by a sense that everything has changed, that the whole world seems to be something that we can no longer recognise, with no promise that's ever really going to change again. I mean, hopefully it will.
The word is new normal, isn't it? That's the phrase, new normal. There will never be old normal.
You guys are really depressing me now.
I'm so sorry. I'm actually quite a nice, happy, funny person.
Yeah, me too. I'm a pretty, like normally happy, jolly, chilled person.
I've got another book out in Spanish in a few weeks, a translation of one of my older books, and they would love me to be at the festival, and they keep writing to me as if I'm coming, and they don't seem to appreciate that doesn't necessarily seem the most sensible thing to do, even though the rules are changing to the position now where technically I'm able to do it. And it's hard because you want to say, and I do try and say, just because the rules have changed to allow me to do it this moment, I'm not convinced that in a week's time they won't go back, because everything feels very, very fluid at the moment, and everything just seems like we don't know what the rules can be. Suddenly to be told, as we're going to be, I think, here in Britain in the next week or so, well, we are, aren't we, that we now have to be 1 meter apart rather than 2 meters, as if somehow magically that overnight that becomes a more sensible, it either worked or it didn't. And it's seeing those things at the same time, desperately wanting, as I do, some restoration of ordinary life, because I do want it and I really do seek it. And also at the same time being frightened of it because I don't have any faith that the people who are imposing those things upon us and telling us it's now right have our best interests at heart. So it's a very tricky thing. And I'm aware this is very depressing.
So work, that thing.
Yes.
You have a new book out. You've already had the launch of your special edition, which sold out completely, almost instantly.
Yes.
3 volumes, 101 tales. We all hear stories in the dark.
Well, I didn't quite, it sounds silly, I didn't quite understand how stupid my book was until I had it delivered in the post yesterday, because it really is only one day I've had it now. And I mean, this is my book, because it is just one book. It's just in 3 volumes because, well, you can see why, because they couldn't actually make it fit in one. So this is my book. That's, you know, and it's relatively, it's not big print, and it's about 650,000 words, which is stupid, really, because my first short story collection years ago was about 70,000.
I remember I came to your launch.
Yes, you did. Thank you for that. Back in 2007, and this is about 10 times longer. It's still only one book. It's just that I've become more garrulous.
So this garrulous feeling, I understand this with this book, we can work our own way through. So you can pick, you want a more scary, depressing story or a slightly lighter, less horrific story. Is that kind of like the journey? Maybe.
This is the idea, yeah. It's trying to be, I wanted to do a modern day Arabian Nights. I wanted to try and say, well, partly because I think in the short story world, at least here in Britain, the community is, I mean, it's wonderful and it thrives and they do extraordinary work, but there's also something slightly fragile about it. And they see short story collections as being like poetry books, and they're often quite short and they're often very, very delicate. And I wanted to try and sort of say that the short story is a very, very robust form. And I thought it would be fun to suggest that we could do it as a massive choose your own adventure. So you open the book and and there's a prologue that everybody reads. It's about a man who's recently lost his wife, and he finds at a local library access to a special library card where he can access every single one of the books ever written and read them in 2.5 weeks flat, because the only problem with our reading is that we read everything in the wrong order. And if we read everything in the right order, it'd be easy. You know, you could read Crime and Punishment in Russian in a nanosecond, as long as you've just read Black Beauty. And people never do this. So everybody also has their own special order. And he's told that if he can do that, because his wife was a book lover and he wasn't, he'll find some way of reaching back to her. And he reads everything ever written and feels no better. And he's also now read everything, and everything he tries to read subsequent to this makes no sense. It's gobbledygook because it's now in the wrong order for him. And he's led to the back of this library where Scheherazade from the Arabian Nights still exists, really. She's not identified as that for a while. And she says, I have the 101 last stories in the world. And at the end of each story, I will ask you 5 questions about your response to them. And the questions might be intellectual, they might be flippant, they might be academic, about how you react to them. And that will dictate which story you go to next. And you'll start carving your own maze and your own way through the book. And if you find the one single path that you read every single story without going back on yourself, you win his dead wife back. So when you start, the first thing that you do after the prologue is it asks you very, very easy question. It says, do you want to start with something sad, something funny, something bitter, something sweet, or something dark? And you make your choice, and that's story 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And from there, you'll get another 5 questions, and you start going through. And we we were speaking, as I was writing, it took about 10 years to write because it's a lot of work. We were speaking to various mathematicians about how many permutations there really are in the book. And they did some calculations and they said that if you take all the grains of sand on Earth and multiply them by all the drops of water, that's a nanosecond of a fraction to how many ways you can mathematically read this book. So part of the fun of it is that the odds against anybody else reading the same book that you choose to read, because all the stories knock on each other and they all affect each other and they all respond to each other in ways. The odds the book that you read will be the only time in the history of the world that anyone is likely to read your book. And that was fun to try and devise. It just took a long time.
My overriding feeling when I read your work, which I am somewhat addicted to in a quietly dark way, because it always makes me cry. Most of your work makes me cry and then haunts me.
They are, yes. I mean, well, the book is about, I mean, this makes it sound awful, but the book is about grief. I mean, the book was basically written straight after my mother died, and it also encompasses my father's death as I wrote it. And it's about, I mean, Janie won't mind me saying this is my wife. I mean, she had a breakdown during the time we were writing it, and we both had to deal with the way in which we responded to that, and we both went through periods of depression. So, I mean, it sounds awful. I mean, I'm making it sound terrible, but it's actually a book really about the ways in which you navigate things like that. And yet it's hopefully quite, I mean, it's quite a funny book. I mean, most of the stories I think are quite funny, but there is a sort of tinge of sadness to them. And there are some horror stories, but it's largely not horror. There are some, because what you want to do is that as you go into a story, you're not certain whether it's going to be a fantasy, an adventure story, something which is quite magical realist or terribly realist. And sometimes the stories change on you halfway through. Stories which feel like they're going to be funny become horror. Some stories which feel like they might be quite dark and menacing become very optimistic and uplifting and surprise you. And that's basically the whole, and you get that partly because of the way, the order in which you read them. So some stories which feel uplifting will only be so if you've read stories beforehand which allow that to happen.
Oh.
So the idea is that every story has 5 stories feeding into it. Every story has 5 stories feeding out of it. They all have to have connecting points, and sort of some of which are sort of empathetic points, but some of which are, you know, 2 stories share a talking pig. So it's sometimes you'll say things, you want to see more of a talking pig, and then you might go to that story. So some of them can be very, 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 very silly reasons, but you provide in every story about 10 little bombs, which mean that they detonate elsewhere. It was tremendously difficult to write. I don't know why I did it.
I was going to say that, I mean, what a fascinating idea, and how hard that must have been to actually pull off.
Well, the worst thing was that over the last few years, I would go to meetings. I mean, I would be occasionally given lunches by publishers who were wanting to see whether or not I would do things for them, which was lovely. And then you'd be talking over dinner, and they'd ask what you were currently doing. You'd say, well, I'm busy for the next 3 or 4 years now, I think. And they'd say, oh, okay. And then you'd explain why. You'd say, well, I'm doing this Choose Your Own Adventure Arabian Nights thing. And they'd listen, and then they'd go sort of white. And the one woman just said to me once, but why would you do that? We didn't get a deal, but it was, I'm just relieved really that I found publishers who, when I told them this, found it funny.
Yeah.
And then we had it illustrated. So the book is fully, you know, it has wonderful woodcut illustrations all the way through. I think it's quite a nice thing to read, actually.
I'm really looking forward to it. I'm very sad that I wasn't organised enough with everything else that was going on to have got my limited edition.
I was very surprised by that, because we released it in April. We were meant to be doing a proper physical launch in April. And because it's 101, we had 101 deluxe editions and 101 special hardbacks, and then an unlimited number of normal hardbacks and softbacks. And I thought, because they were quite expensive, I thought, I was writing a special story for the deluxe, which is a story which is divided into 101 pieces, 101 words each, all handwritten. So you get in the post a sort of, it will say this is number 37, and you've got the 37th component of a single unique story that no one else can ever read. I mean, that's fun.
That's gorgeous.
And we sold that out in about 3 hours, and I was surprised. And I thought it was a condition of lockdown, to be honest. I really thought that people, rather wonderfully, were responding to the idea of this never-ending book, because it just means that it gives you can read it over and over and over again and never really go back on yourself, and it becomes a game. And I think people wanted a game at that point. So yes, the special editions went very fast, but everything else is all still there, so people can still read the book, and it is the same book.